The wind cut across the plains like a blade, shrill and merciless, carrying with it the scent of gunpowder, scorched earth, and something older, the smell of a land that had seen too much blood. Under a bruised sky streaked with violet and copper, the frontier breathed in silence broken only by the creak of a lonely windmill and the distant cry of coyotes. Here stood Jacob Mercer, a rancher who had buried more dreams in the soil than he had seeds, a man whose solitude had hardened him, but never fully killed the hope that someone, somewhere, might still call him home. Jacob's days were carved from dust and sweat. The ranch his only companion. Neighbors were miles away, and though he was not old, his heart carried the weariness of a man twice his years. Sometimes he spoke aloud to the empty air, as if the prairie grass and the weathered fence posts might answer him. Lately he had taken to staring at the horizon with a hunger that was more than hunger. It was loneliness burning into desperation. He had sent away for a bride, one of those brave souls who answered the call of a man she'd never seen. Her heart bound more by hope than certainty, and yet as he waited he wondered if fate had played another cruel trick, if she would never arrive. But Jacob's world was not the only one poised to change. Riding out from the east was a man in scarlet, Lieutenant Colonel Nathaniel Ashton, known by most as the Redcoat commander, a veteran of forgotten wars. He wore the faded remnants of British discipline even here, where the Union flag waved instead of the crown, sent west to assist the cavalry. Ashton carried himself with a rigid pride that masked the cracks in his soul. He had crossed an ocean chasing duty, only to find himself in a land where loyalty was a shifting thing, and every canyon seemed to whisper betrayal. The commander's regiment, tired men with weary eyes and frayed tempers, marched under banners of dust, their boots beating a hollow rhythm against the earth. They had been tasked with escorting supplies and defending settlers against raids, but deep in the canyons warriors watched silent as the stones. The Lakota, driven from their hunting grounds, and the Apache guarding what land was left to them. Both understood the invaders better than the invaders understood themselves. The Redcoats' column was more than a line of soldiers. It was a challenge, an insult, and an omen. Jacob first saw them when he rode into town for supplies. The streets, usually sleepy with tumbleweed and half-shuttered storefronts, pulsed with unease. Wagons circled. Women ushered children indoors. Saloon doors flapped nervously as men paused over whiskey glasses. And then they came. Blue cavalry uniforms splashed with dust, and among them one figure in red, standing out like a wound against the horizon. The Redcoat dismounted with an air of old-world authority, his voice carrying like steel against stone. Yet behind the commander's sharp orders and measured tone lay a heaviness, something only a lonely man like Jacob could recognize. It was the weight of ghosts, the mark of a man who had lost something he could not name aloud. Their paths crossed that evening. Jacob, clutching a sack of flour, brushed shoulders with the commander outside the general store. Their eyes met for only a heartbeat, but in that moment, two men bound by silence understood each other, each fighting battles unseen, each hardened by loss. But neither man knew how swiftly the horizon would turn red. For that night word came in whispers. A band of native warriors had been spotted along the ridge. The cavalry was to march at dawn. The town, trembling at the thought of fire and steel, braced for what would come. And in the shadows of the saloon, a letter changed hands. A warning, a plea, and a promise. The lonely rancher's bride was on her way west, her stagecoach rolling straight into the path of war. The stagecoach rattled like a restless spirit across the dry earth, its wooden wheels groaning under the weight of hope, fear, and the uncertain promise of a new beginning. Inside, Eleanor Whitaker clutched her bonnet with both hands, though it did little to hide the tremor in her fingers. She was 22, and already carried the kind of weariness one might expect from a woman twice her age. The coal dust towns of Pennsylvania had stolen her youth, her parents buried in unmarked graves after a winter of fever, and her younger brother swept away by hunger before spring thawed the rivers. When the letter came, an offer from a rancher in the West, a man seeking a wife to share his lonely acres, she had clung to it like a lifeline. As the coach bounced, she stared out at the vastness unfolding before her, a land both beautiful and merciless. The sky seemed endless, the horizon too far to ever reach, and yet every shadow whispered of danger. She had heard the stories. Stagecoaches burned, travelers vanished, families scattered across the dirt. Still, she told herself this was her only chance at something more than survival. Perhaps Jacob Mercer, The rancher, whose careful script had promised kindness and stability, might truly be the answer to her prayers. Perhaps she would not remain a wanderer forever. Outside, the driver spat tobacco and cracked the reins, urging the team of horses onward. Beside him rode a guard with a rifle across his lap, his eyes scanning the ridges with suspicion. They all knew what lingered beyond sight. Warriors watched from the hills, their patience stretched thin as more settlers pressed westward, bringing fences, rifles, and broken treaties. The driver muttered that the cavalry was nearby, that Lieutenant Colonel Ashton's men would surely keep the roads safe. But his voice carried doubt, and doubt in the west was heavier than lead. Meanwhile, in the town they were bound for, Jacob Mercer sat alone in the saloon, his glass of rye untouched. The chatter around him rose and fell like the tide, men whispering of ambushes and raids, of soldiers marching toward a fate none envied. Yet Jacob's thoughts clung only to the letter folded in his pocket. Eleanor's careful words, her promises, her fears. He read them nightly by lantern light, his heart pulling him toward a woman he had never seen, convinced that her arrival might be the one thing to make his world less empty. But now, as word spread that the stagecoach route cut directly through hostile country, he felt the first sting of panic. At the cavalry camp just beyond town, Redcoat Commander Ashton stood with his men beneath the dying light of day. The firelight flickered against his scarlet jacket, making him appear almost spectral, a relic of another war carried into a place that wanted nothing of him. His soldiers sharpened blades, oiled rifles, and muttered prayers. Yet he kept his silence, staring into the horizon as though searching for absolution. The Americans around him tolerated his presence but questioned his heart. A British soldier leading Union men? The frontier cared little for politics, but men cared much for trust, and trust was scarce. Ashton remembered England's green fields, the clipped gardens, the measured calm of a world that now felt like a fading dream. Here in the raw immensity of the West, everything was untamed, the land, the people, even his own thoughts. He carried the ghosts of campaigns past, friends buried in shallow graves across oceans, mistakes he could never erase. Yet when he looked at the young faces of his regiment, when he thought of the settlers who depended upon them, he found a brittle kind of resolve. Tomorrow he would march. Tomorrow he would test whether the steel inside him could withstand this unforgiving place. And far beyond their campfires, across the ridges lit silver by moonlight, warriors gathered, their voices blended with the night wind. Songs of grief and defiance carried over the plains. They knew the land better than any soldier in blue or scarlet. They knew the river's secret crossings, the valleys where sound traveled differently, the places where cavalry horses would stumble and break. For them, this was not just survival. It was a last stand of their own, a fight to keep what little remained untouched by settlers' hunger. Eleanor's stagecoach pressed forward into that same night, the lantern swinging wildly with every jolt of the road. She clutched the cross around her neck and closed her eyes, whispering silent prayers not just for safety but for love, for a man she had yet to meet, for a place where she might belong. And somewhere between the rattling wheels and the endless stars, fate was already stitching her life to Jacob Mercer's, to Ashton's, to the warriors, threads drawn taut by war, loneliness, and longing. The morning came slow and heavy, the kind of dawn that did not promise peace but instead hinted at the weight of storms to come. Pale light spilled across the prairie, washing the land in a ghostly glow. The air was cold and sharp, carrying the brittle silence that comes just before rifles crack. The stagecoach pressed on, its wheels cutting into ruts worn deep by countless wagons before it. The horses snorted and strained, their breath rising like smoke in the chill. Eleanor sat rigid, her back stiff against the wooden bench, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She tried to appear calm before the other passengers, a farmer with a scar across his cheek, a merchant woman clutching a box of lace, and a boy no older than 12 traveling west to meet an uncle he had never seen. But inside, her heart pounded with the knowledge that every mile brought them deeper into a country whispered about in fear. The guard on horseback rode with tense shoulders, eyes flicking constantly to the ridges. He had ridden these routes before, and he knew too well how quiet could turn deadly. The driver cracked the whip again, urging the team faster, muttering about catching up with the cavalry column rumored to be marching a day ahead. Then came the sound, faint at first, like wind against stone, but sharper, closer, a cry that was neither bird nor beast. The boy in the coach asked what it was, his voice thin with fear. The farmer swore under his breath. The merchant woman clutched her box as though it might shield her. Eleanor leaned toward the window. Catching sight of shadows flickering on the ridge, her stomach dropped. Before the driver could shout, the ambush descended. Riders burst from the ridgeline, painted faces flashing in the sun, horses pounding with thunderous rhythm. Arrows whistled through the air, striking the ground around the stage like the teeth of an invisible predator. The guard fired his rifle, the shot echoing wide while the driver whipped the team into a desperate gallop. Dust exploded behind the wheels as the coach lurched forward, tilting dangerously on one side before slamming back down. Passengers screamed, clinging to whatever they could grasp. Eleanor pressed herself against the wooden wall, the cross around her neck digging into her palm as she whispered prayers through clenched teeth. She could feel the terror of every soul in that coach. The boy whimpering, the woman sobbing, the farmer gritting his teeth as he loaded his revolver with shaking hands. And yet beneath the fear she also felt something else, a fierce, stubborn will. She had not crossed the country to die nameless in the dust. Miles away, Jacob Mercer rose from his bed with a weight he could not shake. He had dreamed of fire, of horses screaming, of a woman's voice calling his name, though he had never heard it before. Unease gripped him as he saddled his mare, the leather creaking under his hurried hands. Townsfolk spoke of warriors sighted near the coach trail, and Jacob's heart hammered with dread. He did not know Eleanor yet, not in the flesh, but he knew enough to fear for her. Sometimes the soul feels what the eyes cannot see. In the cavalry camp, Commander Ashton's men stirred restlessly. The reports of native bands growing bolder had spread quickly. Ashton stood over a crude map drawn in dust, tracing his gloved finger along the stage route. He had argued with his captains the night before. Some demanded they fortify their position. Others urged them to ride and protect the settlers. Ashton knew hesitation could mean blood spilled across the plains. The Redcoat's jaw tightened as he gave the order. They would ride toward the coach route, steel ready, banners high. If an ambush came, they would meet it with force. Back on the trail, the chase had become a storm. Arrows shattered the side of the stage, one splintering the wood inches from Eleanor's shoulder. The guard's horse went down in a spray of dust and blood, throwing him violently. The driver shouted, his face streaked with sweat as the coach jolted wildly. The farmer fired out the window, the report deafening in the enclosed space, but the warriors pressed closer, circling like wolves. Eleanor's breath came ragged. In that chaos, she remembered Jacob's letters, the careful handwriting, the promise that he was a man of faith and steady work, the quiet hope he had bared to her. She held on to that memory like a lifeline, as if by believing in him she could summon some strength of her own. The ridge ahead narrowed into a canyon pass. The driver whipped the horses toward it, desperate for shelter, desperate for anything but the open plain. Behind them, the riders closed in, their cries echoing off the stone, and from the far horizon came a sound that cracked the air apart. The blast of a cavalry bugle, shrill and commanding, rolling like thunder over the land. The canyon swallowed the stagecoach like a beast devouring prey. Dust rose in choking clouds, the horses screaming as the driver lashed them forward, his face pale and streaked with fear. Inside, the passengers clung to each other and the wooden frame, their world jolting with every violent turn. Eleanor felt the air grow heavy, the stone walls pressing in like jaws, the cries of the riders behind them echoing until she could no longer tell where danger ended and her own heartbeat began. Then came the blast of rifles, not the panicked fire of the farmer's revolver, but a volley sharp and disciplined, cutting through the dust with the weight of trained hands. Soldiers appeared at the canyon mouth, cavalry uniforms dulled with grit but unmistakable, their horses rearing as sabers flashed in the first light of day. At their center rode the Redcoat commander himself, Nathaniel Ashton, his scarlet jacket burning like fire against the pale cliffs. The warriors did not falter. They wheeled their ponies with practiced grace, their war cries piercing the chaos. Arrows loosed with precision born of generations who had hunted this land before the first settler's wagon wheel cut its soil. They were not fighting for plunder or sport. They were fighting to hold what was theirs, and their fury carried the power of loss too long endured. The clash was sudden and merciless. Sabers rang against tomahawks, rifles cracked, and horses reared. The canyon became a cauldron of noise, dust, and blood. Ashton barked orders, his voice carrying over the din, steady and sharp as though he had been born in this chaos. Yet his eyes betrayed something else. The knowledge that no order, no strategy, could ever tame a land that fought back with this kind of ferocity. Inside the coach, the passengers shrank low, the wood shuddering with every impact outside. The boy cried openly now, clutching the merchant woman's sleeve. The farmer reloaded, his hands slick with sweat, muttering curses between teeth clenched so tightly they nearly cracked. Eleanor pressed her face to the small window, her fear so vast it had become something quieter, deeper. Awe. She saw men fighting as though the world's edge was at their heels, saw life and death balanced on every blade, every breath. Her eyes fixed on the commander. Through the haze she caught glimpses of his scarlet coat as he moved like a man chasing both duty and redemption. He fought not only with his saber, but with the authority of someone who had carried commands across seas, someone who had once believed war was a matter of honor and was now learning it was only survival. And yet, for all the fury around him, Eleanor thought of Jacob. Somewhere beyond this canyon, he waited unaware that his bride-to-be was trapped in a storm of steel and dust. The thought of him, steady, lonely Jacob Mercer, became a thread she wrapped around her heart, keeping her tethered to something gentler than the violence around her. Meanwhile, Jacob himself rode hard across the plains, the hooves of his mare pounding like war drums. He had heard the bugle in the distance, faint but undeniable, and it pulled at him like a call not meant for his ears but for his soul. He did not know if he would find her stage, did not know if he was chasing salvation or death, but he could not stay behind. Love, even love still half-born, not yet spoken aloud, can drive a man into madness or into bravery. Back in the canyon, the tide shifted. More warriors poured down from the ridges, their silhouettes sharp against the morning sky. Arrows darkened the air. A cavalry horse went down screaming, throwing its rider beneath trampling hooves. The coach shuddered as a shaft buried itself in its side, missing Eleanor's shoulder by inches. Ashton wheeled his mount to intercept, rallying his men with a ferocity that shocked even those who had doubted him. Scarlet gleamed through dust and smoke, a defiant beacon, but already blood stained his sleeve where a lance had grazed him. He ignored it, pressing forward, determined to hold the line long enough for the coach to break free. And then, for the briefest moment, silence fell. The bugle blared again, echoing against stone, and the driver, seizing his chance, lashed the horses with all the strength left in him. The stage lunged forward, wheels rattling, passengers thrown against the walls. Eleanor clutched the cross at her neck and whispered Jacob's name, though she had never spoken it aloud. The canyon roared back to life as steel met stone, as cries rose once more, and the stagecoach barreled past the chaos, racing toward the uncertain safety of open ground. The dust had not yet settled when the echoes of gunfire faded into the canyon walls. What remained was silence, thick and unnatural. The kind of silence that comes after the earth itself has held its breath. Broken sabers glinted in the dirt. A horse, riderless and bleeding, limped into shadow before collapsing. The cries of the wounded carried upward like prayers, raw and desperate, mingling with the hiss of wind through the stone. The stagecoach rolled on until the driver could no longer force the horses forward. Their flanks steamed, their eyes wide and wild, foam dripping from their mouths. When at last the wheels ground to a halt on the open plain, the passengers spilled out into the brittle sunlight as though the wooden box they had occupied was a coffin, and they had been granted reprieve. Eleanor's legs buckled as her boots touched the earth. She clung to the side of the coach, her breath ragged, her face pale beneath the dust. The boy clutched her skirt, trembling, and she steadied him with a hand that shook only slightly less than his own. The merchant woman collapsed to her knees, sobbing openly, while the farmer leaned against the wheel, staring into the horizon with eyes that seemed to see nothing at all. For a long while, no one spoke. The silence pressed down on them heavy as stone. Then slowly, Eleanor lifted her head and looked back toward the canyon. Smoke still lingered there, curling upward like dark ribbons against the sky. She could not see the men who had fought, did not know who among them still lived. But she knew that within those walls courage and blood had been spent in equal measure. Inside the canyon, Commander Nathaniel Ashton stood among the wreckage of his regiment. His scarlet jacket was torn at the sleeve, the fabric darkened with blood. His men moved like shadows tending to the fallen, dragging the wounded to what shelter they could find. Some sat in stunned silence, their eyes hollow, while others muttered curses into the dust. The commander gave orders in a voice rougher than usual, his English accent cutting through the weary air. But his tone carried no triumph. He knew too well that there was no victory here, only survival purchased at a terrible price. He paused beside a young soldier, scarcely more than a boy, whose chest rose and fell in shallow breaths. The lad's eyes met his, wide and afraid, and Ashton knelt, placing a hand upon his shoulder. No words could soften what was coming, so he offered silence instead. A silence that spoke of shared humanity, of grief carried across oceans. When the boy's eyes dimmed at last, Ashton straightened slowly, his jaw tight, his gaze fixed on the distant plain where the stage had fled. He thought of duty, of how his orders had been to guard supply lines and settlers, to hold the frontier for a nation not even his own. But beneath the weight of command stirred something older, more personal. He thought of honor, yes, but also of redemption, a hope that perhaps saving strangers might silence the ghosts that haunted him. Yet as he looked upon the bodies of his men, he felt the hollow truth. No deed could erase the past. Eleanor and the surviving passengers huddled near the halted coach, uncertain whether to press on or return to town. The boy clung to her hand, his knuckles white, and she realized he had no one else now. No uncle to greet him, no family waiting at the journey's end. In that moment her heart swelled with both sorrow and resolve. She had lost too much in her life to turn away from another soul adrift. She lifted her chin, the prairie wind tugging at her bonnet. Somewhere beyond this plain was Jacob Mercer, the man who had written her letters in a hand steady but lonely, the man who had promised not wealth nor ease but something rarer, a place where she might belong. Her body trembled from the memory of arrows striking wood inches from her flesh, yet her spirit steadied as she imagined his face. She had not crossed half a continent to falter now. Back in town, Jacob rode hard into the streets, his horse lathered with sweat. Men called after him, asking if he had heard the bugle or seen the smoke rising far to the west. Jacob ignored them, his eyes wild, his heart torn between dread and determination. He dismounted in a rush, tying his mare to the hitching post outside the saloon, and stormed inside to demand news. But the saloon was hushed, filled only with whispers and the clatter of nervous hands on empty glasses. No word had yet come. Jacob gripped the counter, his knuckles white. He had lived years in silence, years of burying hope beneath chores and fences, but now every part of him burned with urgency. He knew, without proof, without logic, that Eleanor was near, that she had been caught in the storm. And he knew he would ride until the land itself gave out beneath him if that was what it took to find her. And somewhere between Jacob's desperate search and Ashton's weary command, Eleanor stood on the plain, her skirts torn, her hands blistered, her heart both heavy and unyielding. The town lay under a heavy sky, clouds rolling low as though the heavens themselves bent down to witness the aftermath of violence. Jacob Mercer rode back through its weary streets, every hoofbeat echoing his own restless pulse. He had searched the outskirts, had asked every passerby if news of the stage had come, but silence met him at every turn. Still he would not stop. The fear that Eleanor was gone pressed like iron on his chest, but so too did the stubborn faith that she lived, that she was somewhere on the plain, waiting. And then, near the edge of town, he saw it. The battered stagecoach limped forward, its wheels crooked, its driver hunched with exhaustion, the horses stumbling with every step. Dust coated everything, the passengers within more like ghosts than living souls. Jacob's heart leapt, his breath catching as he dismounted in a rush, stumbling toward them like a man crossing a dream. Eleanor stepped down slowly, her bonnet askew, her dress torn at the hem. She looked smaller than he had imagined, but there was a light in her eyes that no ambush, no terror had managed to snuff out. For a long moment, she simply stood, her hand still resting on the frame of the coach as though unsure the ground beneath her would hold. Jacob froze, unable to speak, his throat tight with everything he wanted to say but could not find words for. When at last their eyes met, the noise of the street fell away. She knew him instantly, not by his face, for she had never seen it, but by the steadiness in his gaze, the quiet strength that had lived between the lines of his letters. Tears blurred her vision, yet her lips curved into the faintest trembling smile. Jacob stepped forward, his hand hovering before he dared to take hers. Rough palm against soft fingers, a gesture as fragile and as powerful as a vow. "You came," he whispered, though he knew the words were foolish. Of course she had come. She had crossed deserts, endured storms, faced death itself. She had come for him. Eleanor's voice trembled, yet it carried with it a kind of defiance. "And you are here." The world around them was battered and bloodied, yet in that fragile moment, they belonged to no one but each other. But even as hope flickered in their meeting, another story pressed onward in the distance. Commander Nathaniel Ashton rode into town at the head of what remained of his regiment. Their numbers had been halved, their faces gaunt, their uniforms torn. Silence fell as they passed, the townsfolk watching with uneasy respect. Ashton sat tall in the saddle. Though his sleeve was still stained with blood, his eyes hollow. He looked neither left nor right as he guided his horse through the street. He had saved lives, and of that no one could deny. Yet his gaze held no triumph. He knew what the settlers whispered, that the attacks would not stop, that the land itself rejected them, that the next battle would come sooner than any wished. And he knew in his bones that his own time here was running out. That night Jacob brought Eleanor to his ranch. The place was modest, a house weathered by storms, fences leaning under years of neglect, but to her eyes it was sanctuary. She touched the rough wood of the doorway as though it were a sacred thing. Inside, the air smelled of dust and leather, but also of safety. She sank into a chair while Jacob lit a lantern, his hands fumbling in his nervousness. For the first time in years, the ranch was not silent. Eleanor told him in halting words of the ambush, of the canyon, of the scarlet figure leading men into chaos. Jacob listened, every muscle tight, rage rising in him at the thought of her terror, awe tempering it as he realized she had endured what few could. When she finished, he reached across the table, his hand covering hers. "You're safe now," he said, and for the first time since the journey began, she allowed herself to believe it might be true. But across town, Commander Ashton stood alone beneath the stars, his scarlet coat hanging heavy on his shoulders. He gazed toward the horizon where the canyon lay, where the cries of his men still seemed to echo. He had lived his life chasing honor, chasing duty, and yet here at the edge of the world he felt only the certainty that he would not leave this land alive. Still, if his last stand could buy others even a breath of peace, settlers, ranchers, even lonely brides searching for new beginnings, then perhaps the ghost might grant him rest. As dawn broke once more, the west stretched wide and merciless before them all. For Jacob and Eleanor, the fragile birth of love in a place that devoured dreams. For Ashton, the shadow of his final reckoning. And for the land itself, the promise that no heart, no matter how scarred, would remain unchanged beneath its vast and unforgiving sky.